All right, we've imported our model, we're ready to go. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about something that may feel a little bit intimidating or scary if this is your first time working in 3D, and that is the idea of UV maps and texture maps. So whenever you're creating a 3D model, what happens is you need to go through this process of UV unwrapping, and I'll kind of explain what that means. So basically, let's take our character here. If I paint this kind of janky S on it, you'll see that I'm just interacting with the surface itself and everything is looking great. But what's actually happening under the hood is I'm not painting a 3D object. I am painting on a wrapper for that object that's being laid out flat. Imagine if this was a piece of candy and we were shrink wrapping that candy in plastic, and now we need to lay it out flat. And that's exactly what UV unwrapping is. What Substance 3D Painter does really well is it kind of hides all this under the surface, so it allows you to only work with the beauty element, and all of the individual texture maps just kind of happen under the hood. Because again, look, like here's the 2D map. These are not done by default when you build a 3D model. This is a separate step in the process in other 3D software, but you can see that it's just basically each component of this model laid out flat and laid out evenly. Now I can certainly paint on this, and I could say, here's 1 and here's 2. And as I circle around here, you can see there's the 1, there's the 2, and because what's happening is I can either paint on the 3D and it gets projected on the 2D, or I can paint on the 2D and it gets projected on the 3D in the final output. But basically everything that we're seeing here, this is what gets translated over. Now, I mentioned on the import, if you haven't created these when you're 3D modeling, if maybe it's a CAD model that doesn't have UVs and you export it as an OBJ and you're ready to import it here, you can automatically generate these. Because what you're looking for here is, again, every individual component laid out flat with space between them. Because if, let's say, the bottom of these two shoes were over top of each other, if I painted here, it would go on both of them. But since they're separate, I can do them individually. So if you ever open this up and it's just a bunch of stuff overlapping each other, it's because the UVs aren't laid out well. Or if you go in this and I try and paint something here and it's actually showing up down there, it's because the UVs are laying over top. At that point, I would recommend going back in, re-importing the object and saying auto UV unwrap, because that'll take care of that. That'll take those things that are layered over top and lay them out flat. Now, I would recommend, if you're doing a detailed character, to go ahead and work with whatever application that the 3D model was built in and lay out the UVs by hand, because that will be a cleaner approach and a more streamlined approach. But me personally, I don't like doing that. So I generally will often just use the auto UV unwrap from my model. But just know that it's like any other automated feature, that actually doing it for real by hand is a better process. All right, so let's talk about what's another step of this. So again, so far we've just been looking at the beauty material. So let's take a look at another material. So if I drag and drop, this is from the asset library, the color solid paint wet. So this is a wet paint with droplets on it. And again, I can go down here in my parameters and I can change the color of that paint. I can make that really, whenever I want. And we've got tons of other parameters that control the scale of the drops, the water density, all that kind of stuff. Now, the one question is, again, let's talk about what's happening under the hood a little bit. You can see here we've got our material that's putting all that stuff together. But the way that 3D and 2D are different is, I'm just going to hop over here, is that 3D or 2D is pretty much just worried about color, right? Anytime you have a layer stack in here and I wanted to fade this down, it would just be fading down the color. But something that you have to consider with 3D is that it's more than just color. It's also, like, you can see that the water droplets have added this extra height. So if I go in and I can adjust the individual height of this as well, because these layer stacks, so we're in the base color one, I can switch to the height layer stack and then bring that down, and you can see the height goes down as well. Additionally, there are things like the roughness, where I can take down the roughness of this as well. And you can see that blends in as well. So just know that when you're working with a 3D asset, there is a bunch of individual maps that are going into it. So if you look at this again, this is the overall Beauty 2D version of this. This is the Beauty 3D version of this. If I switch this to just looking at the base color, you can see that that is an individual map that's being created. And so renderers will want to look at these individual maps, and that's how they actually translate the data onto your 3D object. So there's things, again, like base color, metallic. This is not metal at all, so it's black. Roughness, you can see where the areas of it that are a little bit rougher are going to be white, and the areas that are super shiny, these droplets, are black. So that's going to be no roughness at all or super shininess. And then again, we have the normals that help push out the bumpiness on it. Same thing with the height. And we can see all that combined in the normal height and mesh. You can cycle through these by hitting the C as in Charlie key on your keyboard. And if you ever are like, oh man, I'm looking at this, how do I get back to my original? You can either just select material up here at the top, or you can just hit the M as in Mike on your keyboard as well. But that is the basics of that. It's just, and again, we can get into this later, but just know that like each time that you add a layer and making any adjustment to our scene, what we're actually doing is affecting these 2D maps. Like if I wanted to make this more metal, I would add a new layer, and then I would change, go into the metalness, and we're looking at the metal side. And as I slide this up, you can see it changing from black to white. And what that's doing on the beauty of it is it's taking it from a non-metal material and turning it into a metallic surface. So again, all of those individual maps combine together to get us the final look, but Substance Painter does a really great job of just allowing us to interact with something inside of this final view so that we don't have to really mess with that anymore. Or not mess with it too much, but it's good to know what's actually happening. In case you're seeing a problem, you can investigate by clicking through some of these and seeing what's happening under the hood. All right, cool. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about the layer stack and how those can be built together to make some really unique looks inside of Substance 3D Painter.